Hello, welcome to the Fight Sites MMA podcast. This is a special episode. It's one of our famous prediction panels for UFC 264. It's the trilogy fight between Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier, also co-headlined by Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Gilbert Burns. It's a very cool fight, probably a number one contender fight in the welterweight division. If we have time, we'll also be discussing Ilia Topuria versus Ryan Hall, a really, I would say, decently high stakes featherweight fight. Whoever wins is going to be jumping up a decent amount. And yeah, we're going to break down all the fighters involved and give our predictions on the matchups. So I'm joined by my esteemed Fight Site staff members. We have, you might know him as Iggy, you might know him as Tumen, but he's right here on my left on my screen. And we also have Sriram, my regular co-host for the Fight Sites MMA podcast. And we have the strongest and handsomest staff member, Zach Makovsky, a longtime MMA veteran, MMA world champion, and a good writer and analyst himself. Any words to say before we get going, everybody?
Words.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, I just scared them into following a really strict format, and then I gave them the opportunity to be free form, and now they don't know what to do. So we're just gonna get going. We're just gonna get going. But basically, we're each gonna talk about the fighters involved, and then we're gonna go back to the matchups and our predictions. So, starting off, just talking about Conor McGregor. Definitely a fighter I was invested in for a long time in his career. As soon as he debuted in the UFC, I was very much interested. Definitely different than anything else we had seen at that time. A pressure fighter who could counter, who could kick, who was huge and athletic for the division. Enjoyed his whole run, really, even up to when he knocked out Jose Aldo. I wasn't quite the fan that I am today at that point, but I was big into him. And then, things changed, moved up the division, had to change his game a little bit, didn't quite work as well, but there have been ups and downs since then. And of course, with his personal life, we've learned a lot more about him as a person that made me like him less. But at this point, he's still a very high value fighter, high quality fighter. And this is a dangerous fight. I mean, going into their first fight against Dustin Poirier, the second fight against Dustin Poirier, everyone was calling that a terrible stylistic matchup. And Dustin Poirier, by a lot of people, is rated number one in the world at lightweight. So, despite what you think of how far he may have fallen, Conor McGregor is still a very real threat, still a huge hitter. Still decently composed when he's not gassed out. Just, definitely some holes in his game that have been there the whole time that people have had more and more time to get a read on. And physically, I think he is on the decline and can't fight the way he used to. So it's limiting his tools even more. But somebody that you don't want to count out, especially physically or athletically. He can definitely still surprise people, especially early. But that's all I have to say about him right now. I would say I think we're going to get into it more when we start discussing the matchup. Tumen, what are your general reads on Conor McGregor as a fighter?
Well, beyond the usual staples when people discuss McGregor, like, oh, it's the left hand, the biggest hitter at lightweight, etc., etc. What's interesting is that is how his development is kind of like defined by basically essentially him coming up with stuff to make his own game make sense, as opposed to his coaches kind of like helping him develop. Because when you look at SGB Ireland, it's not first of all, it's not a very accomplished gym. It's not a very large gym. And John Kavanagh is not exactly like, as it turned out, he's not really the MMA mastermind that everyone pegged him as. And as a result, you can also, McGregor is kind of like uniquely MMA in the sense that he kind of developed his own process, his own game. Like when you look at his very early MMA fights, it's like basically him being the bigger, more athletic, just kind of all-out insane brawler, and which sometimes hamstrung his ability to finish guys as well as he did in his later career. And then mid-career in Cage Warriors, you can see him switching towards more of a back foot game where he sort of like did the Anderson Silva thing of waiting for the counter. He waited for the guys to barge in and then run themselves onto his left hand. Then he started adding stuff like pressure. Then he started adding stuff like linear kicks to the open side, just more and more kicks. And as a result, it's kind of like, it's interesting because it kind of resembles the typical career trajectory of a of an extremely successful regional fighter, someone like Calvin Kattar in a sense, not in the precise tools that he employed, but kind of like overall conceptually. And as a result, it may have kind of put a bit of a lid on his, put a bit of a ceiling on how far he would be able to go right now when he's sort of like late in his career and putting on years in a certain sense. He's kind of maybe a bit slowing down a bit. Hard to gauge it from his recent performances because he's so inactive in recent years. Ever since 2016, he basically fought like what, 2-3 times, about that. So it's kind of like his game is basically as you described. It's pressure, kicks, and the left hand. It all works beautifully together. But the large bulk of his career was performed at featherweight, where he enjoyed certain physical advantages over other guys. He was bigger, he was taller, he had he had the reach and range advantage, all that stuff, and obviously his power carried more at that weight. And now that he's at lightweight, it's kind of like it's really hard to say whether his power carries all that well at lightweight, but nonetheless, it can be argued that since the guys he's facing are now at size parity with him, they're about the same size, about as strong, about as physical, and they can take the shots better. They can wear him out in the clinch. They can wrestle with him, and they won't be pressured as easily. I mean, people point to his bouts at welterweight, but then again, Nate Diaz is not really like, this gigantic welterweight. It's like, let's say, Kamaru Usman or or other guys that are there at welterweight. Someone like Wonderboy Thompson was also a pretty big guy. And so that's to summarize. Yeah, Nate Diaz is a 300-pound sumo wrestler. Ed is trying to distract me from my point by writing in chat. He said he's going to have a strict timeline and strict format, and he's trying to get this whole thing, trying to derail this whole thing. Anyway, yeah, to summarize, Conor McGregor, an extremely potent force in MMA, certainly an extremely unique fighter. I think one of the only examples of a fighter who really put together a coherent game by himself, who clearly had a process throughout his whole career. But in the process of building this extremely well-oiled, well-defined style, it can be argued that he kind of over-optimized in a sense. He's kind of like a bit over-specialized for like the specific meta that he was facing in, say, the featherweight division in the UFC, and the specific meta that is kind of like works overall in MMA, like the idea of pressure and countering. And also his one important thing, very important thing, is that his overall game is really, he kind of like lives and dies by the southpaw double attack from open stance. And kind of to just allude a little bit to the previous fight with Dustin Poirier, the reason why Dustin Poirier had so much success was because many of Conor McGregor's usual avenues of attack from open stance were closed off, because it was naturally a closed stance matchup, and it was southpaw versus southpaw, and so he couldn't kick as well as he could against an orthodox opponent. He couldn't employ quite the same tools as he's used to employing, like the throwaway lead left hand, which as a result, when in his insistence on throwing the lead left hand, he kind of put himself over his hips and got checked hook over and over again. And that's an important dynamic that we have to point out and going forward. But yeah, that's about the extent of my thoughts on Conor McGregor right now. I may come back to it later in the matchups section of the discussion, point some other things out. But yeah, that's all from me for now.
Yeah, Tumen alluded to it. Conor McGregor is kind of a classically conceptualized southpaw fighter, and that a lot of the southpaws kind of try to emulate him, especially the big ones, because it works really well for them. If you look at someone like Darren Till, a lot of his game is like kind of a worst version of Conor McGregor and what he does. But pretty much all of the staples of the southpaw game are there with Conor McGregor. The southpaw double attack is one, counterpunching is another, and it's a lot more available if one, you're big, and two, you're a southpaw, because a lot of fighters aren't too comfortable closing distance safely when it comes to southpaws. The best example, of course, is Eddie Alvarez, who had a lot of trouble getting through that massive void of a massive southpaw just standing there and pressuring him and kicking him from range and forcing him to be the one to close distance. It's tougher to do that when you can't really use your lead hand in the way that you're used to, and Conor McGregor has generally feasted on that. So that has generally been the route to his victories. He's got really strong distance management, as has been pointed out by pretty much everyone since like the beginning of his UFC career. That's one really strong point of his game. His counterpunching is really sharp. He's got a good trigger on those, especially on his entries, or on his opponent's entries rather, which is why Jose Aldo just walked right into it. One of the more important parts of his game, I would argue, is how fast he starts fights, because given his usual sort of cardio liability, any sort of like warm-up time sort of chops into it. And the fact that he has just such a snap read on what his opponents are going to do, how fast they're going to come in. It's incredibly important, not only in that it catches some of his opponents really cold. Someone like Jose Aldo was a probable example of that, but also that it gives him the largest amount of time to wear his opponents down with the body kicking and the head kicking and use the changeups before he stops being effective. So it's a very strong game for the first couple rounds. I think the issues that we've seen, again, they tend to be from other southpaws. Nate Diaz was an example. Dustin Poirier in the last fight was another example. Is against other southpaws, he's still kind of keyed into that rear hand heavy game, which is, it's a really good asset when it comes to open stance matchups, because again, you're attacking that big void and the open side. But when it comes to close stance matchups, the shoulders in the way, your kicking isn't probably going to work as well, both in terms of that front kick that he uses and the round kick. It's a lot trickier because the shoulder's in the way for one of them, and in the other one, you have to like kick a fairly small point. And the straight, you have to get past the shoulder. So you could see even in the second Poirier fight, McGregor was using the jab, but not really as a weapon, or his lead hand rather was less of a weapon than it was a tool to still find that left hand. And he had to do so much more work than his opponent to really find it. So those are kind of the dynamics that he's working against here. And Dustin Poirier seems like an opponent that's going to test that again. So yeah, that's all I have to say for now. Zach?
Yeah, I mean, like, I've always been really impressed with Conor. He's just sharper and cleaner technique than basically most of the people I saw coming up. But certainly he has a fair amount of weaknesses, and I'm a little bit starting to get a little concerned with maybe his durability. I mean, I think that's always like a question. Like he puts himself in the line of fire to land his shots. Now he usually lands the better ones, but like Mendes hit him with a lot of good shots. Floyd ended up hitting him with a lot as he faded down the stretch. He obviously got knocked out in his last fight against Poirier. Even Khabib hit him with that clean overhand. So I mean, I don't have an actual read on it. It's just something I'm a little worried about if he puts himself in the line of fire. Like I think he will. If he can take shots the same way they used to, I'm not quite sure. So I'm a little worried about that. But I mean, I think he's probably overall the best counter-punching pressure fighter I've seen. I don't know. I have just a really high opinion of him. And I think his kicking game is a huge part that he didn't rely on in the last fight, but I think could be a big part of what he could reestablish. Like certainly any fight he's in that starts to get into a later rounds is an issue, and it's because he fights on that hair trigger. Like he's like poking at you and looking for little reactions where he reacts in a split second with a read, and that's really a hard style to maintain. Like as you get tired, your reactions are slower, like you're processing things slower, your coordination gets a little bit off. So his game isn't sustainable in long fights with a high pace. And the thing is, like, I think Jose Aldo is like that also, except Aldo, when he was like in his prime, made a career of controlling the pace. Whereas McGregor is like much more of a pressure guy, and he kind of pushes towards the action. So if he doesn't end up with a finish, I think it backfires on him a lot. But he's super strong early, like Sriram said, and obviously I think has a ton of tools. I think he could beat anyone on any given day. Yeah, I think that's basically all I have to say for Conor now.
Awesome. Really good stuff. And you're going to keep the spotlight on you, Zach. And let's hear your thoughts, your little breakdown on Dustin Poirier as a fighter, strengths, weaknesses, same treatment.
Yeah. He has a more well-rounded approach. He's not afraid to use his wrestling when he needs to. Like his fight with Duffy, I thought Duffy was kind of doing better than him in the boxing, and he wasn't afraid to make it a grimy fight. You know, he's just willing, I think, more willing to adapt his plan to whatever it needs to be done. And he's pretty relentless, like won't back down. I've seen him like fade and look like he's done in a round, and then the next round comes back. Super resilient guy. I think he's sharpened up a lot in the last few years, gotten way better on the counter. Just kind of rounded out his game and I think, I mean, I don't know, his durability seems to have gone way up too, which is interesting the later you go and the more wars you get in, because he's always in awesome, amazing back and forth fights. I don't know if the weight, like coming up in weight, had anything to do with it, but I don't know. Huge fan of Poirier. Obviously love his crawfish shell. Countering off of that, his lead hook counter like won him the fight in the last fight with McGregor, I think. I don't know. I just think he's a super well-rounded, mentally strong, disciplined guy, class act as a human being. So I don't know. That's Dustin Poirier.
Sure, on back to you.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was going the other way with, okay.
Snake draft.
Okay, my bad. But yeah, I agree with all that. I think Dustin Poirier is kind of, as I mentioned, Conor McGregor was kind of a classically optimized southpaw fighter. Dustin Poirier is kind of the opposite. We've seen in the archetype that I've compared him to before is Robbie Lawler, where rather than leaning really heavy on his rear hand and playing with the distance, he gets inside and he gets behind his shoulders and uses the right hook a bit more. It's a more unique game for a southpaw because the natural hand fight makes it really tough for fighters to fight that way. But the way that Poirier's done it has generally been effective, and specifically against Conor McGregor, the southpaw matchup meant that, similar to like Robbie Lawler looking his best against Johnny Hendricks, another southpaw, which isn't what tends to happen in southpaw matchups. It really helped him having a really developed lead hand. And the other fight where it really helped him was Max Holloway, because Max Holloway was another person who wanted to really step in and build on him. And Poirier just didn't let it happen. Constant right hook counters, playing it off the uppercut. His rear hand is pretty underratedly variable too. He throws like these wide hooks along with the straight. In the finish against Conor McGregor, he like conditioned him to expect the straight, and on the fence he threw this huge overhand. I think he drew like a parry out of Conor and smashed him with it. So lots of really fun offensive boxing from Poirier. Defensively, I think he's still kind of a mixed bag, and it goes back to his footwork being really loose. I think the way that it is a lot of Poirier's offensive potency comes from his ability to shift into range and his levers, and just the way that he's able to mix it up in that sense. But the sort of looseness of his footwork there really does compromise his positioning fairly often. The place where he saw this most clearly was in that early lightweight fight against Michael Johnson, where he walked into the pocket, pretty much gave up all positioning instantly, and Johnson nuked him. That isn't something that he's doing as carelessly these days, but it is something that he's not completely averse to. He's a lot more deliberate in the way that he's shifting, but we saw in the Dan Hooker fight both the benefits and the drawbacks of that. Dan Hooker, when he tried to step back with the jab, Poirier just shifted after him and cracked him while being like way shorter and just consistently got these overhand rights. But when Hooker sort of planted and threw with him, Poirier's positioning was pretty much always in a worse place. That's where that late second round, like he got rocked there, and that was because his positioning was all out of whack. Like he was trying to like close Hooker down, and Hooker just met him in the middle and started throwing hooks with him, and Hooker was in a better stance at that point. So Poirier he's fundamentally a very weird fighter. I said in the last time that we did this sort of panel with the second fight, I think a lot of people sort of underestimate how mentally durable he is, just because he seems like more of a person in the cage than a lot of fighters. He has all these little reset ticks, and it's really fun to watch him fight in that way. But aside from the Nurmagomedov fight, he seemed pretty much unbreakable since that MJ fight, and it's really something to behold. I think his durability is frankly, it's insane, it's freakish, and I don't think it's going to last a ton longer with how much miles he has on his body between the Chan Sung Jung fight back at featherweight, Holloway, Gaethje. I don't think the Alvarez fights were like too brutal, but you go back to Hooker again. There are a ton of really nasty fights in his catalog, and I think that's probably going to catch up with him sooner or later, but I'm not particularly sure if Conor McGregor is the one to take advantage of that. So that's all for me.
Back to you, Tumen.
Yeah, Dustin Poirier, what's a fascinating fighter. Like all his little quirks and all this weird stuff he does kind of sort of belies the fundamentally incredibly solid game that he has, incredibly solid boxing game that he has. He's very fluent with his hands, and whenever he sticks to the fundamentals and tries to employ a more measured approach, a more methodical process, it's just beautiful to watch him fight. And naturally, it's also beautiful to watch him fight when he just lets loose and just goes full on berserker mode, especially in the later rounds sometimes, or when he has his guy hurt. Like Dustin Poirier unloading on someone that he just hurt a couple seconds ago. It's one of the most, I think, prodigious and impressive sights in MMA, just period. And which is something we saw in the second McGregor fight, naturally. And the way I would describe Dustin Poirier is kind of like, I think the word that describes him perfectly is an educated brawler. Really, like he's not really tied to a certain archetype of fighting. He doesn't stick to one style of fighting the same way McGregor does. As Zach had pointed out, he's much more well-rounded. He just sees stuff that's happening in front of him and he adapts to it on the fly. Like he's not really, a tactical genius or a strategic mastermind or anything, but he has a certain instinct for fighting that allows him to just sort of feel what the other guy is trying to do and come up with appropriate responses for it. And so I would describe his game as like a style of trying to take an inch and drag it out into a mile. If he sees an opening, he takes it and he just clings onto it and he just continues hammering these techniques that he can come up on the spot, if provided the matchup is kind of like sort of even. And like as we saw in the Nurmagomedov fight, like since Nurmagomedov outclassed him so badly in one area of the fight, he struggled to really do the same things that he usually does, which is fight his way out of hairy situations. His almost his entire game is kind of sort of built around like just basically he's kind of like a just fight sort of fighter. He doesn't think about really in terms of like what sort of gameplay I'm going to employ. He does try to employ game plans, but it's mostly built around just trying to fight his way out of trying to be more gritty or like more tactically proficient in certain areas of the fight as the fight goes on. And and yeah, the points about his defense, it's kind of like his style is, you could say that his style is kind of ramshackle, but it kind of makes sense overall in a way. Anyway, it's kind of like Jack Slack, I think, said that it's ugly stuff done, smart stuff done ugly. It's kind of like in a way, it's kind of beautiful. And hang on. Yeah, the point about defense, it's kind of like he used to go for the double. His development process was very interesting. Like he started as this wildman brawler, like a shit-hitting wildman that just kind of constantly went after his guy. And then he started slapping on and on and on more, like more wrinkles, adding more wrinkles to his game. And he developed this very, like, he went from the double forearms guard to this crawfish shell. But the thing about his defense is he's like, it's hard to pin him down, Poirier. Like sometimes he counter punches from his defense. Sometimes he just uses it as the novelty cover up. Sometimes he shows beautiful footwork. Sometimes his feet are all over the place. Sometimes he's boxing beautifully. Sometimes he's just swinging like massive overhands from one end of the cage to another, like throwing these massive baseball pitches. And then he goes back to normal boxing. It's his as Sriram said, is very human in the way he fights. He seems much more like a person than any other fighter. He's not trying to stick to the techniques. It's, I mean, you can see the gears turning in his head, him trying to think up of ways through which he can stick to the process. He can ways through which he can get back into the fight. All these little ticks, all the nodding of the head, talking to himself, adjusting his shorts, all that stuff. Really just a fascinating character, much more of a character, I suppose. Like, what makes him interesting, what makes Dustin Poirier interesting is not only he is a very exciting and fascinating and interesting and technically intricate fighter, but he's also wears his emotions on his sleeve in a way. And I think that's why he's so captivating. But yeah, just what makes him interesting as a fighter from a fight standpoint is, to summarize, is that he's once again, an educated brawler. He's basically a brawler that likes to fight, that loves to fight, and loves to have these like just insane wars. But nonetheless, he still has enough crafts to win at the highest level, despite being like quote unquote non-technical, because he's much more crafty rather than masterful, I'd say. And kind of like he sort of blurs the lines between being a brawler and being a crafty technician, I'd say. And that's my evaluation of him overall, I guess.
Beautiful. Yeah, you guys nailed it. I actually don't have anything else to add other than, the thing that really holds all of that together is that he is in just phenomenal shape all the time, extremely fit as a fighter. Has this weird cardio where he'll definitely get tired. He'll slow down. But he always has a second, third, fourth, fifth wind. Like, he's never completely out, but you can, if you're a certain type of fighter, take advantage of those gaps, as Khabib did. And, there are a lot of other gaps he took advantage of. But yeah, Dustin Poirier, like, really what makes him elite, I would say, are the attributes that hold up that style. And that's true for pretty much every fighter, but it's still good to identify what those physical factors are that allow that to work. So matchup, it's their third fight together. First fight, Conor McGregor led and punched around Poirier's guard and hit him really hard a bunch of times. Then he got knocked out. It was pretty straightforward. It happened pretty quickly. Second fight, I think Poirier wanted the same kind of fight. He said, I want you to do what you tried to do to me last time, and I'm so much better now. I'm going to get you. So a lot of it was, jabbing with him, trying to draw out those same leads, using that check hook to stifle his combinations, and throwing in some of the new defensive looks that he had, like slip in and rocking back, and a little bit of the shifting and like rolling out from his own entries. Of course, he mixed it up as well. The calf kick and took it a big role kind of later into the fight. It's only a 2-round fight, so it's not that long, but not there are clear like sequences in the fight, like periods of the fight where certain things were happening. There was the clinching, there was the boxing before the clinching, there was everything that happened after that when Dustin started kicking more. But he started to get a better read on what Conor was doing in the lead. And I think that's the most important thing, is that when Poirier did lead, he made sure he was exiting, you could say, responsibly. Rolling out or ducking out of your, rear hand, like shifting entries, isn't always a safe way to do it. But because, like Zach said, Conor McGregor is so hair trigger with his counters. He has these counters that are so like second nature to him. So like the muscle memory is there. He's going to throw straight at your head over your lead, rear hand. So he knew every time he threw that he could be gone. So he had that down really tight. Kicking on when McGregor stepped forward was great. Jabbing with him, trying to draw out his own leads, trying to evade, check hook, counter, and counter kick. That was all great stuff. And then, as soon as it looked like the tide was turning at all, and McGregor slowed down, and he was in front of Poirier just unloaded on him and threw like a 20 punch combination. It's just not something everyone can do. But yeah, I would say the ring craft is definitely an interesting part of the fight, that Poirier just kind of was wherever he needed to be to let the rest of that strategy continue. It wasn't that important to him where he was in the cage. And that's pretty consistent in most of his fights. And that's something that really hurt him against Khabib and can really hurt you against grapplers. And, he did lose some of that fight against the cage. That's not really a replicable strategy for Conor McGregor. I think Dustin recently said, like, I win the fight 10 times out of 10 if it goes past the first round. Obviously an oversimplification, but that is the general dynamic, is that Conor loses a ton of efficacy once he, deflates a little bit. He doesn't have to gas out totally to become a very different fighter. Like the pop on his punches, the power really changes once he starts to get a little bit tired. And Dustin had a good game plan of making it so things happened early on, so they could have some sort of fight before the fight, before he could settle in and box with them and actually take some shots, and it would be okay because he was more settled in the fight. You're not cold, you're not stiff. You can kind of absorb some more of the impact, see what's coming a little bit more. So I thought it was a very nice game plan. On our prediction panel before that fight, Sriram and I were the Dustin Poirier pickers. I definitely saw a path, and a lot of it depended on him surviving early on, and then just winning on pace, essentially, his attributes coming through. And I was partially picking just to manifest the victory, but I saw there was a path. That is, it did seem like the Conor knocking him out early path was more likely. What has changed between that fight and this fight? I mean, Conor McGregor is now aware of that game plan. I think that's something that could be a factor, but it's really hard to predict how someone's going to adjust to having seen something. I mean, the fact that these things worked on Conor McGregor wasn't like a one-off thing. It was like, I have his entire career to study, and here are things that are definitely going to work based on every fight I've ever seen. How much can you really change in 6 months? And how much can you try to change and succeed in changing in 6 months? And for Dustin Poirier, he just got some more data about what worked about his game plan, what could be better. And, he got to, test it out and have it work, and then still gets to refine it and have it work even better. So some things that I think might not work as well. Maybe his kicking game won't work as well. I feel like it's going to be one of those things where McGregor is buying into his own narrative and is like hyper focused on not getting kicked. It's going to be really like check happy or something. He's going to have something to deal with being calf kicked. And Dustin Poirier seems aware of that. He said he expects Conor to try to kick him. He's just, sure, why not? So I don't think Dustin Poirier is going to do the exact same game plan. I also think the takedown that he got early in the fight, basically weaving under his lead straight into a really reaching double with an outside trip finish. It was pretty bad, but but it definitely took Conor by surprise. Entries are very important, and it was a well planned entry, even though the execution was a little strange. And as Zach hates that kind of finish, where you're basically falling to your hip to take him out the trip to finish. And I'm with him. I think that's really risky. But it worked there. But Dustin tried it 2 more times after that and got nowhere with it, because Conor just got his hips back a little bit as he's reaching, and because it was such a terrible double leg, he's not going to get it. So I don't think that'll work, but I don't think it needs to work. I really don't think Dustin needs all the things that worked in the second fight to work again. I think basically he can box with him pretty comfortably now. I think he knows that he can clinch with him and be fine, even if he's not winning those exchanges. And I hope to God that he just mixes in a little bit of level changing with his boxing approach and hits Conor's body just a little bit more than he did, which was not at all. I don't think he hit his body once. And I forget who it was, but someone was like, does anyone ever hit Conor's body? I think he would hate it. And I was like,
It was Danny Martin.
That was Danny Martin. Yeah, shout out Danny Martin. But I'm ready to pass the torch. So you're good. You're good to speak for sure. But yeah, I'm picking Dustin Poirier again. I feel like obviously I feel more confident than I did last time because he did beat him, and I already picked him last time. So yeah, I'm picking him.
I mean, he also beat him in a very replicable way. It wasn't like a fluky, weird knockout. He basically just dismantled him, basically just solved him. And that's why kind of like it's hard to predict what Conor's adjustments are going to be coming into this matchup. It's kind of like almost pointless to try, like, because the man is also a serial bullshitter. He likes to just kind of put out the narratives out there, like just kind of like say stuff to make to generate engagement, and then do this completely different thing in the rematch. But I mean, didn't really have all that many rematches, I think, in his career, and just basically just Diaz and And
Yeah.
basically that's it. And Poirier, yeah. And like even in the second Diaz fight, it wasn't like some kind of like monumental, completely rehashed approach. Like he didn't really completely remodel his entire approach to beat Diaz the second time. He just tried to basically do his usual Conor McGregor things against Diaz, and as a result, kind of really faded really hard in the later rounds. But yeah, discounting Conor McGregor is I'm hesitant to completely write him off because he's not completely ancient. He's still has potent enough attributes that could carry him a long time from now into his later years in his career. And of course, there's the matter of his power and the sheer fact that he starts so fast and so early. Like those are all still very dangerous things, and those are all things that Dustin Poirier will need to navigate in the third fight. But overall, I think I agree overall with your point about the approach this time around. I think Poirier is pretty comfortable winning in many different ways, but the most optimal approach would, of course, to be just mix the martial arts, just basically just MMA corner as much as possible, optimized but kind of like optimize it a little bit, maybe add a little strategic wrinkle to the game plan, like starting to work more on nutritional damage early on. Like the idea about wearing Conor out in the first round by clinching with him and wrestling with him is an excellent idea, but you could also add some ground and pound. You could also add once again body shots. Could also add some, I don't know, maybe threaten some submissions just kind of like sort of put the idea out there. Not, of course, sell out on a massive guillotine, as Dustin Poirier likes to do. Which I mean, I suppose it's also doable because Conor McGregor is not really like, a really dangerous top player and a submission machine from top. So, I mean, I guess why not? Overall, I think Dustin should try the same approach, but just a bit tighten things somewhat. Like avoid getting hit with the clean counters this time, clean left hand shots. But one important point, in the previous fights, in the second fight, Conor still hit him clean with that fabled left hand, the fabled left straight, and Dustin, like, it shook him up a bit, but he still took it. He was still fine with taking the shots. He still saw the shots coming, and it's an important point. Like the point about durability, I think Zach raised in the early part of the discussion, is that maybe it's the weight cut, cutting less weight made Dustin Poirier more durable. But I think there's also another aspect to this in that since he fights much more with his feet under him from a proper stance, and he's able to see the shots coming much better as opposed to when he fought early in his career, when he just did this and just couldn't see anything. That's also played a factor, I think. But yeah, I think the avenues for victory for Conor McGregor are the same, really, as there are for every single Conor McGregor fight. It's this really sort of narrow lane, like just pressure and hit your guy lots in the face and in the body. That's pretty much it. Find the counter. Meanwhile, Dustin Poirier can do much. I'm usually hesitant about picking fighters who are more diverse simply by virtue of them knowing more attacks. But this is precisely the case where I would lean towards picking the guy who's just more diverse and more well-versed overall, more well-rounded as an MMA fighter, which Dustin is. And so the idea is the same, just wear Conor out early in the first two rounds, mix things up, drag it out a little bit, and then beat him up. So unless Conor hits on some really perfect adjustments for Dustin Poirier, I think Dustin takes it again. And about the adjustments, like Ed recently put out an article, which I don't think he's very proud of, but nonetheless, it's still a funny idea in that Conor McGregor could use his shoulder strikes to set up takedowns along the cage. But I mean, even if Conor McGregor takes Dustin Poirier down, I'm fairly certain Dustin Poirier is fine with being taken down by Conor McGregor. He's not fine with being taken down by Khabib Nurmagomedov, but then again, who is? So I wouldn't say it's that much of a really big danger. He's not in a big danger of getting submitted or pounded out. And so what else Conor could do? I guess Conor could target the body with his boxing, use his jab more, actually jab with Dustin Poirier instead of trying to throw these weird leaning left hands and getting check hooked all over again. So really, I know up front, I'm picking Dustin Poirier because he just plain demonstrated much more avenues through which he could win, to me personally, and that's why I'm picking him. And I'm currently trying to come up with ways through which Conor McGregor could conceivably win this rematch, and the avenues are all the same as they've always been, just pressure and hit lots. So I'm hesitant to just kind of even try and pick Conor McGregor in this rematch, not to sound biased or anything, but that's just how it is. I mean, I guess I'd have some more additional thoughts after this discussion, but I guess that's it for now. Nothing comes to my mind.
Did I forget to say I'm biased? I'm biased.
I'm very biased.
There you go, Sriram.
Yeah, I have pretty much the same read. I don't have a ton to add. I think the idea of the leg kicks being completely integral to Dustin Poirier's game, I think it's a fair thing to say because he leg kicked in both of those fights. But what really changed between those fights is how much more troublesome it was for Conor McGregor to get his own game going. In the first fight, we saw it wasn't just Poirier's defense that improved. It really did improve a lot, but it was that Conor McGregor could kind of just close distance behind his lead hand super easily and start working around the guard for free. Poirier didn't allow that to happen in the second fight, started catching pitching with the right hook just immediately. And I think that's really what shut Conor down, even with Poirier's ringcraft being at best apathetic. That's kind of the way I describe it. He doesn't really care about it. And here on paper, he had a real reason to, but with range parity and with that right hook, Conor McGregor didn't really have a reason to enter in and do a ton. And that's what set the kicks up, right? McGregor now had to stand at range where he could just enter in and punch Poirier for free. So standing at range set up the kicks, but really the kicks could have been replaced with a lot of things at that point, especially later in the fight. I don't really think it's that integral. What was important was Poirier's ability to buy space early in the fight. And I think that's where the takedown threat comes in a little bit more, because the way that he set the takedown up with his usual shifting overhand, if McGregor's super keyed into that, he can maybe dissuade it. But the fact that the threat is there is probably going to be enough to get Conor McGregor backing off anyway. So the body work is another effective level changing threat to make it more convincing. The takedown threat is probably still there, even just if he shoots a little bit and doesn't get it, McGregor still has to back off to get his hips back in time. It's tough to see a ton of routes for Conor McGregor, especially since he's working with such a defined window of time. Needing to knock out Dustin Poirier in a round is an awful, terrible, it's not the place you want to be. It's not a viable route, a high percentage route for anybody, I don't think. Khabib Nurmagomedov beat him over the rounds by grappling, and maybe you could grapple him in a round. That's something that I would be super shocked to see Charles Oliveira do. Needing to knock him out in a round on the feet, I don't think it's something that you're going to do with any degree of consistency, even if you are Conor McGregor. And the way that Dustin Poirier was able to survive last time, and the amount of work that it took for Conor McGregor to get his game going in the second fight, needing to really take angles to land that left hand, needing to contend with that right hook and jab and do things that he really wasn't all that familiar with or comfortable doing. I don't see him growing meaningfully more comfortable in this fight doing all those things. So yeah, it's going to be a Poirier pick from me fairly confidently. I'm where he is as a fighter, but I don't think this is going to be the fight to show it.
I think Conor certainly has to make some adjustments, but I think he's very capable to make the ones that I think could make a difference just based on watching the last one. Obviously, once he got stunned, he kind of got put on the cage, and then Poirier unleashed his beautiful flurry of 20 whatever punches. But McGregor kind of sat there and tried to cover and see the shots and block them and throw back occasionally, instead of just move your feet and don't stand there so he can't unleash an endless combo. all you have to do is keep moving your feet until you can like try to reset. But he was stunned, so I get it. But I think McGregor stunned Poirier a lot in that fight, several times, 2 or 3 times. I think Poirier was like really shook. But yeah, he's much better on the counter, and I like the way they counter is a little different. Like Conor's always like leaning, baiting, pull or slip, and land like a really precise counter, whereas Poirier has much more of that catch and counter you in the middle of your own shots. And I felt like what really got Conor in trouble, I think the kicks were hurting him, and he definitely has to deal with that. But really, what led to the end of the fight, and he did it a bunch of times, is staying there after his left hand, trying to throw that like long lead uppercut, and he got cracked twice with counter hooks. And I mean, I think if he just decides to set up his left hand and get out after his left hand, he probably won't be there for those same kind of counters, because Poirier, at least in that fight, and most of the fights I've seen, isn't the guy who's kind of like baiting you to like pull and catch you as you're throwing. He waits till you're throwing, and in the middle of your combo, catch and hit you with the hook, or shell and hit you with the left. So I think if Conor sticks to like just setting up his left, landing the left, and retreating, and keeps landing it, I think he will hurt him and potentially stop him. Yeah. And then I think if that happens and Poirier, and he's not staying there for Poirier to catch with the counters, and he's dealing with the kicks, then it's going to be on Poirier to adjust. I'm going to pick Conor. I think he's going to muster some mystic magic alliteration. I'm going to pick him by TKO at the end of the first, but I agree. Like, I'm not like super confident in the pick. Knocking out Poirier is no easy task, especially when you're forced to do it early. But I think Conor is going to come out hard. He's going to put all his eggs in the, I know I got to get it done early basket. So he's going to go for it, I think. So.
Cool.
Yeah,
So I'm glad we're not a monolith.
That's an interesting point. Like the way like most people are able to counter Dustin Poirier is by drawing him in and forcing like really dangerous entries from him. And I don't think. I wonder if Conor will be able to like gauge that from in the span of 6 months. From what I mean, I guess he just, if he did nothing but watch tape of Dustin Poirier throughout these 6 months and drill these specific counters for his counters, I mean, yeah, I guess that's an interesting thing to point out. That's something to look out for. Speaking, of course, about Dustin Poirier, he has to look out for that stuff. But I mean, like any Dustin Poirier fan should hope that Dustin Poirier remains disciplined with these entries and with his boxing, which is where most of the fights will take place. I think it's a safe bet. But yeah, like generally speaking, I think I'm like 60-40, leaning towards Poirier, but still giving Conor a good shot. I think the same as everyone. I think everyone sane would do that. It's not like a completely confident unanimous pick that Dustin Poirier will just demolish Conor McGregor again. Right. It's just that the avenue for Conor McGregor is a really narrow one. That's the reason why it's kind of like hard to pin down.
They have both knocked each other out before, and they're both older than they've ever been before. So anyone knocking the other one out isn't really that huge of a shock at this point.
Another short thing I'd like to point out is that Dustin Poirier is like an interesting example of a fighter working around his disadvantages and like his injuries, because Dustin Poirier has struggled with his hips for a really long time. And God knows what kind of like issues he's hiding, and God knows what kind of issues Conor McGregor is also hiding. And at this stage in their careers, having been through so many fights, and Conor McGregor having taken so many beatings in recent years, that's also like throws a bit of a wrench in things. Could kind of like, it could turn out at any second that's one of them is just fallen off like 2%, and that's all that's needed for the other guy to win, basically, and for the whole game to fall apart. Yeah, high level competition do be like that.
So true, bestie. All right. So another fight that I think is at a pretty high level, maybe not the same level, but a high level regardless. And it's welterweight, where the matchmaking has been pretty bad for a while. So this is refreshing. We have Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Gilbert Burns, 2 former title challengers, very different styles, and one that might seem straightforward to some people. Sriram's leaving and coming back to me. but I think is actually a little bit nuanced. Just to he's not here, but Ryan Wagner is very confident about this fight, that Wonderboy winning, and I will try to disagree with him. But let's do this definitely at a faster pace than the last one. But let's keep the format. Zach, I'm going to have you start talking about Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, because I think you know the guy.
A little bit. I mean, nicest guy MMA. One of them, without question. What an amazing dude. Yeah, I mean, I know I'm like the Wonderboy, the guy who defends Wonderboy on the fight site. I'm always like, you guys don't appreciate Wonderboy enough. But I don't know. I think he has adapted his style for MMA better than anyone else has for like that type of like hands down, long stance, bouncy karate style. He takes like real subtle shifts off the center line, comes back with, you never know if he's coming or going. He's really, really amazing at it. I know a lot. I haven't trained with him directly, but I know a lot of people who have, and they all, and Ryan Hall, everybody at TriStar, Eamon Zahabi, and all those guys, and they have the highest opinion of his striking, and I believe it. And I was around when Rory was in training camp to fight Wonderboy, and we brought in Raymond Daniels, and Rory was doing really good with Raymond. I mean, Raymond's amazing too, but that style is just so. When you're really good at that style, it's really hard to deal with, because they're so fast at closing distance. There's like real subtle angle changes. They're great. Like their sidekick is like a spear in the gut. It's like really hard to get around. And I don't know. I think he's one of the best strikers in MMA. I'm not gonna say he's one of the best kickboxers, which is what I think you guys mainly critique when people say he's one of the best kickboxers ever or whatever. But as far as that style is applied in MMA, probably the best to do it.
I was muted. Sure, I'm still trying to rejoin, so we're gonna skip him for now. And Tumen, what do you think about Wonderboy? Do you watch his fights, first of all?
No, never. I never watch MMA. I don't watch fights at all. That's my secret. I'm kind of like the fight sites Dr. House. I just don't watch fights and still offer my expert opinions, and I'm still usually right. But yeah, no, I've seen plenty of Wonderboy fights, and I've enjoyed most of them. It's kind of like really fun. It's a really fun style with the right matchup. That's how I would put it. Like whenever guys chase after his head, which happens all the time, really. He basically looks like a wizard, like a genius. Like no one can touch him. Everyone's swinging at air. And Wonderboy is just out there taking angles and just basically doing his thing and making people look like fools. And, but nonetheless, it's a style that's, I agree, he respecialized his style for MMA very well. But one thing is that at welterweight, since welterweight matchmaking is so weird, he's been dealing with mostly favorable matchups for most of his career. Outside, I don't know, maybe Tyron Woodley, but then again, it was only the case of Wonderboy not really doing enough to beat up Tyron Woodley, despite having Woodley in trouble several times. And then again, Woodley still also had Wonderboy in trouble a couple of times, in fairly deep trouble as well. But yeah, so. What makes Wonderboy so great is that not many people in MMA are able to strike on angles. Not many people in MMA are good cage cutters. They don't cut off escape routes really well. And that's why Wonderboy is able to just sort of like escape from difficult situations along the fence and look like a masterful ring general in the process. And his hands down style baits people into pursuing his head, into head hunting, and that's when he shines. Just puts his head out there, just takes a little bit of an angle, counters you, usually drops everyone. But this style also carries some inherent weaknesses. The sheer fact that he stands so side on, in fact, for one, like it's a like in in Kung Fu, it's usually called a horse stance or a horseman stance. Basically, just he stands side on and his feet are on the same line, and it's a stance that very is susceptible to leg kicks, to both normal leg kicks to the thigh and to stomps to the knee, and it's something certain fighters have tried to employ against him. Someone like Jorge Masvidal, for example, or Vicente Luque, but the problem was that their kicking game was too disjointed from the rest of the rest of their overall MMA game and even their boxing game. So like they didn't try to kick off their punches, and they just sort of went, I'm gonna box you now, and now I'm gonna kick, and that allowed Wonderboy to just sort of anticipate the kicking motion and then counter the opponents he was facing. And so basically those, and also naturally, since he stands so side on, it's somewhat difficult for him to just avoid to defend himself in prolonged exchanges in the pocket. Once the exchange goes past the initial counter, and if the guy is able to hang in there, he still hasn't faced a guy who was able to do that consistently, but it's still a certain thing you have to keep in mind when watching Wonderboy fight. Like since he stands so side on, and since his hands are hanging by his nipples, whenever the exchange gets deep, he's bound to get hit, and he usually gets hit a lot when the exchanges aren't going his way. It's just he's lucky to have a really good chin to go with his style as well. And also, in recent years, he's not a very young man by any stretch, either by fight game years or just in normal years. Still looks fantastic though, but he's kind of slowed down a little bit. Like you could see in the Jeff Neal fight. Like I'd say if Wonderboy was a couple of years younger, he would be able to style on Jeff Neal in a much more impressive fashion and get a much wider decision, maybe even finish Jeff Neal, who knows. But one thing that concerned me, while it was an excellent, like a really impressive performance, really crafty one as well, but also really baffling from Jeff Neal, like the way he had hunted the whole way through. But one thing that concerned me is how Wonderboy seemed to injure himself while fighting Jeff Neal and while still styling on him pretty much. And he looked noticeably worse for wear at the end of that fight, after having dominated Jeff Neal so thoroughly. And he still, I think he still was nursing some injuries from that fight. So that's a problem. That's a concern. But yeah, overall, a very interesting fighter, very entertaining fighter as well. And that's about the extent. That's the extent of my thoughts on him for now.
Sriram, what do you think of Wonderboy? And welcome back.
Microsoft Teams decided to open itself on my computer, and apparently the interaction was just complete poison. So I'm sorry about that. But Wonderboy is a fighter that I've always kind of thought. I wouldn't say I've thought less of him than a lot of people, but I do think that the lore around him is at the very least kind of misinformed. A lot of it's kind of based on like having a really flashy sort of kicking style that isn't as effective as I think a lot of people think. So on the outside, a lot of his game is like that intercepting side kick and the spinning kicks, which they're not really the sort of attritive game that you tend to see from really strong kickers in MMA. It's back on my computer, by the way, so I might join in after this. But where he's really succeeded in his recent fights is in his boxing, and really his understanding of boxing is a lot stronger than people think, I think. It's kind of, so that side-on stance, it really does hurt him when it comes to defending leg kicks. And when it comes to pocket defense, he's not really all there. I don't think that's because of the side-on stance necessarily. He's just not super aware. But his ring craft is, I think, what really carries his game, really, like, the whole thing. Is that he's got really, really good ring craft. He's really good at getting his opponents to chase him and really misdirecting them around the cage. And I think that's really what confused someone like Jeff Neal, who could only use like one cage cutting tool at a time. He started out with like trying to right hook him, and then he started kicking the body off his rear leg, but he could never like put the two together, which is really funny to me, but it was also kind of sad. But
Yeah, in general, welterweights don't tend to really be too strong at pressuring. The exception being Rafael dos Anjos, who he never really fought. So that's one factor. But I think the fight that really shows his limitations more than any was probably Darren Till, just because Till kind of pressured from long range, excuse me, kicked the leg and threatened the counter on entry. So a lot of what Wonderboy does is if he can't like misdirect you and you pressure really patiently, he needs to buy space with the blitz. And against someone who could really consistently threaten counters on his entry without like giving him the room to angle out, giving him an exchange and trying to counter in there the way someone like Luque or Neil would, he struggled a lot. And Darren Till just didn't really give him the opportunity to enter into those exchanges and buy space. He threatened the counter on entry and eventually got Wonderboy to the fence and knocked him down. Wonderboy still arguably won that fight, mostly on like both guys doing very little through the whole thing, which is another common criticism of Wonderboy. But it's the sort of thing where I don't know if, and I guess I'm skipping forward to the matchup here. I'm not sure how many people can do that to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He's like a really big, dedicated pressure who's solid at it and has a game that's a bit more tuned to countering guys on entry than Gilbert Burns or Vicente Luque or Jeff Neal. So I think it's a game that he's very good, but he also has a style that tends to make fighters fight worse than other styles of that same commensurate skill level would make people fight. It's kind of similar to Darren Till himself. You can look at him and you can see he does good things, but also guys never really approach him well. And I think that's what I'd really like to see out of this fight from Gilbert Burns. But that's all for me for now.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to say about Wonderboy that hasn't been said. Just I've always been impressed with his ability as a I don't know, not traditionally. Oh, you're re-entering the room, Sriram. As a double. I've always been impressed with him as a counter puncher, a very different kind of counter puncher than others. More so just like not like evading, like slipping and countering in a traditional boxing sense, but just kind of, getting himself out of range and lacing people up with straights or, running them into side kicks, things like that. I've always been impressed with that. That's a lot of what he did to like Masvidal and Luque and Neil a decent amount. And the volume on it is impressive. His accuracy is impressive. The fact that he's still doing it at his age is impressive. He impresses me in a lot of ways. It's just frustrating because in different style matchups, like against Woodley, where he has to lead more in order to do the same thing, he's a lot more gun shy, a little bit worried about counters and wrestling, and not as confident, I think, in his abilities. I think if you like put him in front of a person who wasn't doing anything and didn't have to worry about it, he could do some pretty cool stuff on the lead with his hands. But it's just matchups, I think, can affect him, his approach in a decent way. Gilbert Burns isn't that kind of guy. I'm going to move on into Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns isn't that kind of guy. He's a hoof trained grappling based fighter. There's like 20 of those, and they're all very similar. That they throw 2-3s, and they're working on some counters. They low kick, they round kick to the body. They do some basic combinations, which is honestly more than you can say for a lot of strikers in MMA. They don't do these tried and true combinations and counters, but at his base, he's a very explosive grappler, working on his wrestling a lot. One of the most improved wrestlers I've seen from people that come over from sport jiu-jitsu, and one that relies more on leg attacks than other jiu-jitsu players I've seen. Has worked a lot with pure wrestlers, and that camp is really good for that. They have Greg Jones coaching down there. They have Kami Barzini coaching down there. They have a bunch of really great wrestlers in the gym. So if you're not getting better at wrestling at hoof, then you're not working on it, honestly, because they have everyone you need for that. It's kind of like how Dustin Poirier made these huge leaps with his boxing when he started working with a boxer, Dia Davis. It's a very similar type of thing where these guys are going down there, actually training with wrestlers and becoming good. Same with King's MMA. Those guys got all so much better at wrestling when they trained with a wrestling coach, even though that guy was like a club coach working mostly with like high schoolers. Yeah. Like wrestling and MMA, like they need that kind of work. So I've always been impressed with that aspect of Gilbert Burns. He's a really good athlete. He's very strong. Gas tank a little suspect. He definitely drops off. I don't think it's because he's in bad shape. I think his style is just very energy intensive. He throws everything super hard, and he's liable to fall off after some time just because of the way he fights. But I mostly like his game. I was impressed with his approach to Kamaru Usman. I think that was the full showing of his strengths and weaknesses. He really put himself out there, really gave a good account of himself, was really, spot on with the counters that he wanted to hit, threw him well, threw him at the right time, threw the right ones, nailed him. Couldn't knock him out because Usman has a giant brick head. And then he tried to get back to his usual game. He shot him a few times, didn't work, and fizzled out. And walked onto a bunch of straights, which is, I can see for sure, if you're like, okay, he walked onto Usman straights, that's gonna happen against Wonderboy, probably. But I'll circle back to myself for my prediction. But let's run back through for Gilbert Burns' thoughts if you guys have them. Let's go Sriram, since you went most recently.
Yeah, I think Gilbert Burns is kind of an interesting fighter. He's kind of the quintessential hoof sort of fighter, in that a lot of the guys that he gets are like grapplers first, and then he gives them like these really strong striking games that are like, they're not the prettiest or like really fancy, but they're very functional, and they're kind of prosaic, and it's fun how they're prosaic. They're like really distinctively prosaic, if that makes sense. And
can you define prosaic for me?
I mean, it's like the opposite of poetic in that it's functional, but
that's our zone.
It's boring,
man.
But it works.
Pretty much. But yeah, it's that sort of game. I think a decent parallel is Vicente Luque, and that's not a drawback necessarily, but in a matchup with Wonderboy, it looks like a drawback. But Gilbert Burns, as Ed mentioned, he has the wrestling threat a lot more than Vicente Luque. He's got a really good drive, and I was actually really impressed with the way he approached Tyron Woodley. I mean, it's hard to be impressed by an approach to Tyron Woodley at this point in his career, because pretty much everyone just had to do things to beat Tyron Woodley at this point in his career. But it's the sort of thing where I kind of enjoyed his win over Woodley a lot more than the two subsequent ones, and kind of over Usman. It was definitely less comprehensive than the Usman one, but it was a lot more fun and a bit more damaging to like the head, which people tend to enjoy. But yeah, he did a good job working into range in that fight. Sort of used the lead leg kick threat and the jab to pick at him from range and enter range to blast him with huge combinations in the pocket. Like that a lot. And I think it's the sort of approach where I'd need to see him pressure people a lot more, like who don't want to be pressured, who don't back themselves up to the fence, or maybe super convinced in him as a really effective pressure fighter. But the Usman fight did convince me a lot that he at least nominally deserves to be where he is. I wasn't super convinced by, for instance, the Kunchenko win. I don't really think it was a win at all, really. But he did enough good work in the Usman fight that I think he's a dangerous fight for a lot of guys. I really enjoyed that cross counter he landed early on Usman's jab. Two, I actually enjoyed how he sort of played with attacks to cut off Usman's takedown entries. He had this nice switch knee, and he played the overhand counter off the uppercut to keep Usman from just shooting and using the jab as the change up there. So he has a good it might just be a teammates thing where Burns has fought Usman a lot of the time, and he knows what Usman likes and what he doesn't like. And he just went in with a super specific thing that he could do for Usman and not anyone else. But if he puts that level of thought into this fight, I think it's one that he can make difficult. I'll keep the rest of the matchup portion. So on to whoever's next.
Maybe Tumen.
So what my thoughts on the matchup or on Burns?
Just Gilbert Burns, yeah, if you have any.
I mean, not much, but Burns is kind of like one of those like overall decent guys that have managed to get the big break in a division that is horrendously mismanaged. And overall, like, he's a functional fighter. He's a solid grappler, like a good, decent kickboxer. I mean, he's a Hoft fighter. What else can I say about him? He just he's decent at MMA. That's about the extent of what I can say about him. And as well, also I could add that man has one of the better meme games on MMA Twitter out of MMA fighters themselves. So that's about the size of it. I mean, everything was covered fairly extensively by both of you.
No problem. If you're good, Zach, do you have thoughts on Gilbert Burns? And then you can go into the matchup if you'd like.
Am I missing out by not following him on Twitter?
I saw the one coffin meme. That was a good one.
I mean, he does have his moments. That's how I would put it. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a tentative recommend to follow Gilbert Burns on Twitter.
I mean, I think Gilbert's a good fighter. He's explosive. He throws a lot of hard power shots. He gets into range to throw them, and he can blast you if you're there. Obviously, a great grappler. He can wrestle, but I don't think he's like especially adept at baiting people into takedowns. all the time. I think if he wanted to get his wrestling going, I think he would struggle a bit unless he could like back into the cage or something. And yeah, I don't know, kind of a meat potatoes, explosive guy, but I wouldn't say a fast guy. Definitely dangerous. Like you don't want to let him clock you or get you on the ground, because I think he could snatch up a submission pretty quickly too. I'm also I'm a little concerned about his durability. He gets hurt a fair bit, and then especially even with jabs. I mean, I know Usman's got like a ramrod jab, but I don't know. I'll go right into the matchup, I guess. I just see like I don't see him being able to track Wonderboy down. I don't really see him being able to time a clean counter on Wonderboy. Wonderboy enters with the idea of the guy's going to be countering him in mind. So he's almost always already like offline or exiting and baiting the next shot. If you throw your counter, he's going to counter that counter. And I think he's just a little too crafty. I think Burns' chance would be to get a takedown. I think he could probably, but I don't see him being clever enough with his setups to track Wonderboy down and bait him into to a clean takedown. So I'm going to take Wonderboy either by decision or maybe a late stoppage if he's landing enough. Yeah. Because I think also Burns isn't the guy that's going to sit back and try to get Wonderboy to lead either. He's going to come at him, and that's kind of Wonderboy's jam, you know. I thought Luke had a more methodical kind of pressure game. If he was going to have trouble against one of those guys, I thought Luke was going to give him more trouble. I think Burns is maybe a little more dangerous with like one shot, but I think he's going to be less likely to actually catch him with one. So I don't know. That's my thing.
Back to Tumen.
Yeah, I think I'm overall in agreement. I don't think Gilbert Burns really has the skill set to kind of like put things together in a way that would allow him to trap Wonderboy along the fence and exploit the weaknesses that I've pointed out in the previous Wonderboy section, namely the stance problem, the leg kicks, the pocket. Gilbert Burns relies much more on single powerful shots. I'd say he does throw in combination, but he doesn't throw in combination all the time, and he doesn't really have this. Doesn't really have an educated lead hand game, and he doesn't really have the ability to just kind of like counter right off the bat, as he would be forced to against Wonderboy. He did land a counter on Usman, but then again, Usman is not really like a striker first. So Usman is still kind of like trying to learn striking on the job. And so it's kind of like, yeah, sure, Usman got clocked, but will Wonderboy get clocked? I'd say only in the pocket. And I mean, the only concern would be for me is that Wonderboy is kind of like slowing down and starting to age quite a bit. And that's where Gilbert Burns may have an advantage as a more powerful, more explosive guy. But once again, Wonderboy is a really crafty cage, like a ring general. And so I don't think Gilbert Burns' cage craft is quite at the level at which he would be able to consistently track Wonderboy down and hurt him, unless Wonderboy has slowed down really, really badly, or like some of the previous injuries that he's taken in the previous fights have taken their toll. So it's kind of like hard to predict. It's really generally hard to predict things like that, things like decline in certain fighters. But with Wonderboy, it's reasonable to assume, since he's kind of like he's a veteran fighter. But still, Wonderboy by decision still feels like a much safer pick right here for me.
How about you, Sriram?
Yeah, I'm going to start out by saying I'm going to pick Wonderboy, but that's mostly because I'm going to say a lot of nice things about Burns, and I don't want it to like kind of color it. And I might change my mind, but I'm not sure I will, because I know Ed has a much better read on the wrestling matchup than I will, so I don't really know. But I think the striking's really bad for Burns. We've seen him not really command the cage as strongly as I think fighters need to in order to really beat Wonderboy. Guys like Damian Maia backed him off at will. Guys like Konchenko could buy space. It's not like the way to beat Wonderboy tends to be to command the cage better than he does. Someone like Darren Till did. And guys like Tyron Woodley, at the very least, they controlled where the fight happened, even if it's my back is on the fence and you have to come to me. They had an idea of where the fight was going to be. I don't really think Gilbert Burns has that. And if you're going to pressure Wonderboy, you need a good idea of how you're going to approach doing that. Someone like Vicente Luque, for instance, he had like some good ideas early in the fight where he started like levering off his lead hand to cut off the exit, cross countering to push him back. I'm not really sure Gilbert Burns has that. He had like a decent cross counter on Usman, but it's not something super consistent. He's shown a left hook, but a lot of it is like a lot of what he does is like after his opponent steps in, like lingers in the pocket for a second. Wonderboy isn't the type to really do that. So I think it's tough. I think Burns probably outkicks him. But also probably gets his kicks figured out later in the fight, because I don't really think at kicking range he's one to really set his game up. If he gets Wonderboy against the fence, I think he's a decent threat, but I'm not really sure that's super likely. And I hope he does better than I think. Wonderboy is kind of an age liability, at least a little bit at welterweight. He's like 38, and his style is kind of dependent on reasonably thin margins. So it's going to be tough for him, I think. I think he's going to take a couple shots, a couple leg kicks, maybe a couple counters, but it's going to be a fight that looks like a Wonderboy fight more than a Burns fight. And maybe he can win against the run of play like Pettis did, but I wouldn't count on it.
Awesome. I'm going to go in a second, but before that, Zach has to roll out and teach some private MMA lessons, I believe, because he is a coach at Finishers in Northeast Pennsylvania. Anything to say before you depart?
No, appreciate being on with you guys. Fun.
Mm-hmm.
Still waiting for you to come visit, train with us, Ed.
Pretty soon. I'm competing at the end of the summer, early fall, so I'll definitely come up a few times before then.
All right, cool.
Get beat up.
Thank you, Zach.
Right. Sweet.
Thanks,
Thanks
Zach.
everyone, Zach. Good to see you. Alrighty. So last thing on Burns, Wonderboy. So I am gonna pick Gilbert Burns, and I'm not deluded to think that he's going to outstrike Wonderboy or even do well enough from the feet to win there in any sense. Like, I don't think he's gonna like blitz him and catch him, but I don't know. Like, I could see him pressuring a bit, not throwing too much, because I mean, you have to actually, put yourself in front of Wonderboy for him to start countering you. So you could pressure a little bit more lightly than usual. Throw low kicks, which is a thing that he does. He throws them. Mechanically, like him and Luque, similar issues, I would say, but Burns throws them harder. So that's like automatically going to be helpful. That he can cut off exits a little bit better, and I think just
especially against an aging fighter.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the, I don't know, that's the lining of this whole matchup is that like everything that would work is going to work better, and things that would work for Wonderboy might not work as well as usual. Like it's a constant taking a little bit away.
Do you see any avenues for Burns in wrestling or in grappling exchanges?
That's what I'm talking about. So I think he's gonna be pressuring him, low kicking a little bit to cut off exits to get a little bit better of a shot linearly to the cage. And if they're anywhere near the cage, I don't think Burns needs to pressure him all the way to the cage because his shot is so explosive. It's a useful shot, but it's also flawed that like he doesn't have like chain mechanics. He doesn't really have good finishing mechanics, but he's got a really great drive on it and a really explosive entry. So like not really good setups, but Wonderboy's not like gonna punish you a lot for shooting on him. He's just he's decent at getting out of bad leg attacks, and usually his style makes you take bad leg attacks. You can't get close enough to him, but it's kind of like a nice matchup for Burns in that sense that he can shoot from far away, make contact, drive Wonderboy back enough that they're on the cage. And Wonderboy's just not good enough in the cage where it's not going to be like large sections of the fight where Burns has him pressed up there. And I think Burns, actually is a decent clinch fighter. I don't think he's going to get like a ton done there, but like he can chain into upper body takedowns. He has some nice judo in his arsenal as well. And I think he can transition back to leg attacks and just, go single and, just make a lot of the fight on the cage. And the reason I'm really convinced of that is because Jeff Neal did it. So if Jeff Neal did it, I think a better wrestler and grappler than that is going to have an okay time doing that. So it's not a super confident read, like Zach said. The durability is a huge question mark. Like, is he just going to get sat on his butt the first time he walks into one of Wonderboy's straights? Quite possibly. But I see this where Burns' wrestling style actually does match up pretty well. This is a big cage event, right?
Yeah, it is.
All right. So that makes
it's a pay-per-view.
That makes it a bit tougher.
That's definitely more difficult, but I think he can do that. And I just think he's the younger. I mean, he's not that young, but he is the younger guy, especially in miles. Guy, and I think he's very athletic. And some people threw out the possibility that he just like explodes in and catches Wonderboy. And I'm like, I think we're not quite there yet in Wonderboy's career where that's possible. But
he hasn't fallen far enough for that to happen, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I think that's one of the big concerns I have about Burns is that a lot of his ways of driving opponents back tends to be like these huge raids. He did that against I don't remember who he did that against, but a lot of the lightweight he did it a lot. I think he's sharpened that up at least a little bit. He didn't do it as much against Tyron Woodley, obviously. He didn't do it a ton against Kamaru Usman. But Wonderboy's kind of a dangerous guy to do that against, and the way that he fights tends to convince guys to approach him in a reckless way because they can't get close to him. And especially with the double leg, I think it's kind of tough because of how bladed Wonderboy's stance is. You can't really get to his hips as easily. But yeah, I think it's an interesting enough fight considering the wrestling dynamic. I hope Burns gets it done.
Yeah.
Manifested it.
Think it's just that kind of thing where he doesn't actually need to take him down with those double legs. It's just a tool to get the fight to the cage where I think he can win. He can win the fight on the cage. So that's an interesting fight. Whoever wins it, well, I shouldn't say that. If Burns wins it, he might have one more to get another title shot. Especially if it's your teammate, you don't necessarily want to fight them again that quickly. If Wonderboy wins, he's getting a title shot for sure. So that is not that interesting to me because I think we're at the point where Wonderboy is a lot less interesting for Usman than he would have been a few years ago. But it's still something unique that we haven't really seen for Usman yet. So
that's the general problem with the welterweight, isn't it? Is that it's just Usman and everyone else, and you're just kind of sort of trying to scramble for guys who would at least offer something new and interesting for Usman, and that's why Wonderboy is, kind of sort of compelling for Usman in that way.
Yeah.
There's someone who can make it look like Usman's knees are actually going when they go. A lot of people
I've been hearing about these knees for a long time, waiting to see.
I know. It's like if Usman's knees explode against Covington, it's just not even going to matter. Where against Leon or Wonderboy, it might actually matter. So that's compelling.
Anyway, last thing before we go. This, luckily for us, and unfortunately for people who are going to watch the entire thing, this card sucks. And there's really only two, high level competitive fights where both the people are interesting and worth talking about. On this card, they really phoned it in for the rest of it. I think in terms of what you enjoy, there could be a lot, but in terms of what we're talking about, no, there's not a lot to talk about.
They always do that for Conor McGregor headlines.
You don't need
cards.
to, right?
Yeah, it's just Conor McGregor.
You're wasting people by putting good people on these cards because you get all the value you need just out of having Conor as the headliner. But anyway, there is one fight that I do want to talk about. I'm going to do it. So Ilia Topuria, perhaps the best prospect in the UFC. Prospect as in only has 2-3 UFC fights now. 2, right?
Also, still doesn't have a Wikipedia page.
Still no Wikipedia page. He's fighting Ryan Hall, and this is a very, very nice matchup because Ryan Hall either was ranked or is somebody who will probably be ranked if he wins.
The most ducked and avoided fighter in all of history in MMA. Nobody wants to fight this.
Yeah, you look at him,
grappler
he's basically Kamaru Usman but white.
Yeah, but Ryan Hall had a pretty decent sport jiu-jitsu competitive background, came into MMA, and we were talking about the other day on Twitter that his approach to MMA was not. It's funny. I'm pretty sure he's a very anti-Gracie guy. I might be making that up, but it's just funny because his thing is very Gracie, that he wants to show the applications of his style of jiu-jitsu and not really become an MMA fighter. So he takes as many shortcuts as he needs to not fully learn MMA and become this nuanced fighter. So the Gray Maynard fight, or the Darren Elkins fight, or the BJ Penn fight, those are very good representations of what he does. Is he can kick on the outside, and the kicks are effective if your chin is bad, because you don't want to get hit in the face by a kick if you have a terrible chin. Like Gray Maynard is someone who like really could not take a shot at all at that point. So he really had to respect the kicking. Darren Elkins, someone who was famously durable, apparently was also somebody that could not take a shot. And I don't think it's a Ryan Hall kicks very hard thing. I think it's these guys had very poor chins at the time thing. And BJ Penn, similar deal. But also against all these people, he can kick from the outside. And then when he doesn't want to be kicking from the outside, or you pressure him, or he decides he wants to grapple now, doesn't need to waste his time with that wrestling nonsense. He can just Imanari roll, and he's in 50-50. He's in some sort of leg lock, leg entanglement position. He can start to work his game where he's best. Problem is, leg locking in sports jiu-jitsu is definitely the meta right now, and you can work through a lot of different positions. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it. I'm not. But in MMA, it's so different because a lot of these static positions you have to work through, you can get punched in those. And just being on top is so much more of a good thing, so much more of an incentive, that if you just prioritize just being on top and don't try to score points or do anything, it's a lot easier to get through those situations. So it's not like a hypothetical of like what happens when someone can just be on top of Ryan Hall and not have this happen to them. It's happened already. If you don't know, he was on The Ultimate Fighter and he lost before the finale to this guy, Saul Rogers, who's not doing so well right now, but Saul Rogers is British, first of all. So it's not like some like guy with great wrestling credentials. But he's a pretty decent grappler, Saul Rogers is. He just got tapped by Mads Burnell, who is much better than Ryan Hall. He's Topuria tier of talent, I believe. But yeah, Ryan Hall's lost on bottom before. So it's not like if they're grappling, he is automatically very dangerous and going to win. Like there are severe limitations to the style. And Ilia Topuria is a better grappler than Saul Rogers. Ilia Topuria is a grappler. That is his base. He's a very good grappler out of Georgia, training in Spain, living in Spain and training in Spain. And he comes to America a bit. But Topuria being a grappler, having a really good front headlock choke series, just being a very good submission grappler in general, makes this already a really tough matchup for Hall. And he's like, okay, what's going to happen in the feet? Well, it just so happens that Topuria is also looking like puncher. Already first of all, a massive puncher, and turning out to be probably already one of the better boxers in the UFC by virtue of just doing normal boxing stuff and applying, basics and fundamentals to being a really athletic, really physical guy who hunts the body relentlessly, really, really unforgiving body puncher. And I think he's going to beat the crap out of Ryan Hall, who got pressure boxed by BJ Penn.
Yeah. Like all these people who come to MMA, especially from grappling backgrounds, always try to find some kind of like weird shortcuts or a meta they can exploit. But I mean, really, if you want to get good at MMA, just fight normal. Literally just fight normally, please. Learn fundamentals. Do what Topuria does.
I think it was an experiment on Hall's part. And, I think he has a different agenda than just being the best fighter he can be.
True.
So more power to you if that's what you want to do, but it's dumb.
Yes, but still, if you want to get far, if you want to be successful at MMA and not just prove some kind of point or sell instructionals for leg locks,
right?
Yeah, it's better to do what Topuria does and just get good.
Be good, yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have much of an opinion on this fight just because, Topuria kill. I guess that's an opinion, but it's not a particularly nuanced opinion just because I don't have a nuanced opinion on Ryan Hall. I enjoyed the Gray Maynard fight way more than I should have just because it was absolutely hilarious, but it got very old by the Darren Elkins fight because like Elkins was someone who probably should have beaten him if he'd bothered to like hang out on top. Like he showed decent enough submission defense that he probably could have just hung out on top in that fight, but he was just like deathly afraid of doing anything. And, he got kicked a lot because he was afraid of really pressuring Hall past a certain point. So I don't really think Topuria is going to struggle a ton in this fight. And if he does, it's kind of like losing to Neil Magny. Like I won't really be sad because you were bad enough to lose to Ryan Hall. But he should win. He's exciting. He's a good prospect. And it'd be kind of sad to see that turn out to be wrong.
Imagine if Ryan Hall develops some kind of voodoo magic, the same that Neil Magny has. Just
everyone just 50-50s him.
Ooh, you want a 50-50 with me? You want to leg entangle me? Ooh. But yeah.
I mean, Hall's from like 20 minutes away from me, so I feel like I have to support him. I just don't. His style doesn't make any sense. So
I'm just... I'm gonna preface this with the fact that I'm rooting for Topuria, but I'm gonna pick Ryan Hall via Siluev stretch in the second round as a joke.
How dare you?
I'll hold that against you. I definitely will.
If anything happens, it's 100% your fault. So
And also, if
I
you're
mean, yeah,
wrong, you
sure,
were wrong
sure.
unironically.
enjoy having that on your conscience. Killed a prospect with the joke.
That's why I
Fans have a lot of
exist.
power
That's
in
why I
MMA.
employed.
We control these things.
Jokes are now real.
The things we
Yeah,
say
and
on
ju-
the Fight Sites MMA podcast have a direct influence on the course of the fights. And if you don't believe
and-
me, I personally have been responsible for career resurgences in technique from Cody Garbrandt and the Korean Zombie. So I think they
Conor
listen.
McGregor this weekend also. That's gonna happen.
I messed up releasing that article early in the week because now Connor's going to read it and he's going to be like, oh, I have time to drill this. And he's going to actually do it. And he's going to take Dustin down and Dustin's going to say guillotine. And it won't work because his legs will be bundled together because of the technique. It's the perfect Dustin Poirier killer. It's right there. It's right under his nose. The perfect game plan. Guy's going to pressure himself, let you pressure him to the cage. And then he's going to stand up straight because he doesn't like the shoulder strikes. And then he's going to put his legs together. And then he's going to try to guillotine you if you try to double him. And you just do that over and over and you top game him. 5 rounds, Connor.
Connor can do that for 1 round at most.
No, but I think it's going to be like the Garbrandt fight where he takes my advice and he does it for as long as he can. He says, oh, this is too much work. And he gets boxed up.
It's gonna be funny if Conor, exactly. Conor is gonna take down Dustin Poirier a bunch of times and then gas himself out. And then Dustin Poirier is just gonna Khabib him. Just pound him out. I mean, this is just us coming up with funny scenarios for the fights.
Funny scenarios
else
that
have we
will
got to this?
happen, like how Dustin Poirier is going to top game Charles Oliveira. It's going to look a lot like the Felder fight. In fact, it's very, very interesting. And Oliveira might even be winning on the feet. But yeah, Poirier is going to win with ground and pound, or he might submit him as well. But he's going to win on top. So there you go.
Yeah. Poirier got guillotine. Oliveira got guillotine before. The more
I'm thinking
the more they
Darce.
stay the same.
Thinking Darce.
Very
but
possible.
We'll see.
Yeah, I think we're done here.
Yeah, this is the Fight Sites MMA podcast. This is our UFC 264 prediction panel. Made some predictions on 3 fights, and those are the ones that matter. And if you want information on every other fight in the card, literally every other fight in the card, go check out our UFC 264 full preview done by Thaniel and Dan Albert, and they did a good job, I'd say.
Given the circumstances of how you do this card, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
They've done their best to come up with some thoughts about fights that cannot be quantified at all in any way, shape, or form.
They're literally braver than the troops. All right. Goodbye, everyone.